Welcome everybody to tonight's developer session on REFramework. It's also an overview. So if you go to the next slide, Chris. So tonight your speaker is Chris Bolin. He's a senior analyst, finance and technology at Mary Kay. He's also one of our UiPath MVPs. And if you go to the next slide. So a little bit about the developer meeting. We just started this about 4 months ago. And we have a group of MVPs around the country. And we're basically working with them to do specific developer community sessions. So the MVPs that are sponsoring these sessions are in Canada, Latin America, and the USA. And you're encouraged to network with MVPs and share your LinkedIn in the chat box. We want to get to know you. So this is to be engaging sessions. And we also want to know what kind of topics you're interested in hearing about that we can share with the UiPath developer community. So for this session tonight, if you can just put your questions in the chat to start with. I'm Diana Gray. I'm the marketing manager for the UiPath community in America. And if you have any topics, again, that you're interested in learning about, please just email me at dianagray@uipath.com and I'll put that in the chat. So I just have one more slide I want to go through. So as part of this session, we have 4 different topics. So Chris will be going through rework framework overview. That's tonight. And then September 19th, there's another session on modifying the framework. And then October 3rd, he'll be talking about queues, configuration, and creating within the states. And then on the 10th, debugging, workflow, analyzer, and validation. So please make sure that you register for all the additional events at community.uipath.com. And I'll put that information in the chat as well. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Chris. And thank you for coming tonight.
All right, guys, my name is Chris. I am the entertainment tonight. I'm glad you paid the $15 for your tickets. They did pay, right, Diane?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
All right, I'm with Mary Kay. I've been working with UiPath since early 2018. I've built a little bit over almost 330 automations in my experience with UiPath. I teach UiPath to our own developers in our COE around the globe. We have COEs in Russia, Brazil, and 2 in the United States that handle the rest. I focus on the financial end of Mary Kay, which involves 17 different departments. And then we have a supply chain COE. I also teach and mentor college students in UiPath. And just recently this year, partnered with Daniel Dines, the UiPath CEO, to do a pilot program to teach high school students. So I have high school students that are in the throes right now of panicking through capstone projects during this school year. All right, this is going to be a basic overview of the REFramework. If you have more complex questions and you have questions that we don't cover, just throw them in the chat. If you want to throw in your email address to the chat as well, I'll try and respond. I'll respond to those and try and answer those questions. And or find somebody that can answer the questions for you. If you hear background noise, that's my dog running back and forth through the house for some reason. All right, tonight in our session tonight, we're going to talk about what the REFramework is, what it involves, what it contains, and how we can use it to, and it looks like I misspelled project organization, about how we can use it to focus our projects and use our projects. So when we first open up the REFramework, it is, and everybody see my screen, or did I change and you cannot see it, Diane?
I can see it.
You can see can you see an REFramework, or do you still see the slides?
I see the REFramework.
Okay, good, thanks. All right, so when you open this REFramework, you automatically think to yourself, oh my God, there goes my career as an RPA developer, because this looks really complicated and complex, and I don't even know where to start. And if you think about your daily life, You wake up in the morning, you get ready for work, you take a shower, you drink some coffee beforehand, if you're in my world. You put on clothes, hopefully. You put on makeup if you do wear makeup. You get in the car and you go, everything that we do in our daily lives as people is really an RE framework. Everything has a beginning, everything has a process, and everything has an end goal. So don't let the outline or the dauntingness of the outline scare you, because if you think about an everyday process that you do, whether or even if it's a vacation process, you plan for a vacation, you always start with everything you need, and then you go through the process to get to your end goal. So we're going to start tonight. We're going to talk about, and we're going to do our RE framework. And we're going to talk about, I'm just going to skip down here. We're going to talk about initialization. And we're going to talk about what the difference is between an RE framework and a workflow. Not a lot. An RE framework is a series of containers, and within those containers, we do different things in those containers. You can put a workflow in the container, but an RE framework will be in your bot is going to be stuck in one of these containers until you give your bot a trigger to get out of those containers. You can add triggers, you can add exceptions, you can add what you want to add to an RE framework, and that's a little bit more advanced, so we may not get into a lot of that. I'll maybe share some of that with you at the end. But every RE framework is going to start with initialization, and what we're going to do to help everybody kind of key in on it and be able associative with it is we're going to do some baking. You know, and Starbucks just started selling the pumpkin spice latte again, and I don't drink it. For those of you that do, you know it's the onset of fall. And in Texas, fall lasts for about a week, and then we have winter, and then we have summer again. So fall for us is 67-degree mornings and 90-degree afternoons, which is a change. So different than 85-degree mornings and 103-degree afternoons. So we're in the midst of stepping into fall. So we're going to do some baking because I think everybody bakes during the fall. So in your initialization state, if we think about a baking scenario, whether you want to bake some bread, you want to bake a pie, you want to bake a cake, you need certain things to get started. So in our baking, we need a heat source, we need a stove, convection oven, maybe an air fryer. I'm not sure if you can bake in an air fryer, but hey, if you do, let me know. We need some source to cook it. We need the ingredients of what we're going to do in our baking. We need the utensils, whether it be a pan, a loaf pan, a cookie sheet, spatulas, spoons, and we need the ingredients of our baking. We need time to do the baking and do the preparatory work. We need a recipe. Maybe it's grandma's old cherry pie recipe. Maybe it's what's on the back of the Pillsbury cake box. Either way, you need those instructions in order to do the baking. If you don't have any one of those components or things that you need, and you can't borrow them from your neighbors, or what you have is you have an old rock of brown sugar like what I have that you're never going to be able to bake with, and you need to go to Walmart, pick something up, or something along that lines. If you don't have that, it's a non-starter. And so in an RE framework, you can only have one initialization step, one preparatory step. You cannot have more than one initialization container, one initialization step. And anything that fails to meet your needs in that initialization step is going to automatically go to your end process. So if we talk about our baking, in our initialization step, we may come in here and we may say, okay, does the stove turn on? Well, we really don't know if our stove is going to work until we turn our stove on. We don't leave our stoves on 24 hours a day like we do our air conditioners, and we know that it works until it goes out. Our stove only works when we turn the handles or push the buttons. So if your stove doesn't turn on, you're obviously not going to be baking anything. That's a non-starter. It's going to go to the end. Do you have the right ingredients? If you don't have flour and you need flour, and you can't go to Walmart or you can't borrow from your neighbors, it's a non-starter. You're going to go to the end. So anything that you have that you need to prepare for your process, in this case, baking, and it's not available to you, you're obviously not going to be able to bake. So it's going to go to this end process. In an RE framework, you can have multiple end processes, but they're all going to be ends. You can see there's nothing coming out of the end process because it stops. The process stops. If you wake up in the morning, you get ready to go to work, you put on your makeup. If that's what you wear, you put on your clothes, hopefully, and you put on your shoes, and they're both the same shoe. And you get in the car and you have a flat tire. That's a delay. Your car doesn't start. Chances are you're probably not going to be able to make it to work. That's an end process. So everything's going to start in your initialization state. If you successfully have everything that you need to have to perform the process of baking, in this instance, then you're going to go to get transaction data. Now, if we talk about the initialization state as a part of a business process, that would be including, do you have the data you need? Do you have the applications that you need? Do you have the security to those applications that you need? Do you have the login credentials to those applications that you need? Those are the kind of things that we put the initialization state. Now, ideally, you will want to open up all your applications, anything that your bots can interact with in your initialization state. However, let's say we were baking a loaf of homemade bread, and we have to knead that dough and let the yeast rise, knead it again, let the yeast rise. We're not necessarily going to preheat our oven to bake that bread when we have to wait for the bread to actually rise for a few hours. You'll end up burning down your house. So there are some instances that your initialization, your opening of your applications, your turning on of your stove, your preheating of your stove is going to happen much down here in your process state. And that's where you're going to have to be familiar with things like, okay, if you've ever gone to your banking site and you get distracted on your cell phone, on your computer, and your bank says, okay, we're going to shut you down because you've been idle too long. Some applications, especially some of the ones we work with, a lot of SaaS solutions, some applications have a very short idle span. And so if you have a lot of transaction processing to do within your workflow, and you stand a chance of your idle span timing out, you may want to think about putting that application or turning on your stove down here in your process transaction. It's not going to happen very often unless you've got, like I said, a lot, or you're baking a loaf of bread from scratch. And if you do that, more power to you, because I love homemade bread. All right. So if we have all of our ingredients, we have all of our utensils, we have all of our pans, we have all of our things that we need, and our stove turns on, we go down here to get transaction data. And this, in our instance of our baking analogy, would be something along the lines of, we have our recipe, and each one of those components of our recipe, let's say we need 2 cups of flour. We need a cup of brown sugar. We need 3 teaspoons of cinnamon. We may need some sugar. We need specific quantities of each of those ingredients that we then pour into our bowl, and we start mixing it together to make our process, to make our baked good in this case. That's what we're doing in get transaction data. We're telling the bot, this is what you need of each of these things. This is what each of these items that you're going to be processing, this is what they have. These are what they mean. And you're going to be working with this information on this data, or on this step, this process that you're bringing in to complete your process, right? If there is no data, if you forget to tell the bot, hey, well, you have flour, you have cinnamon, you have something like that, and you're not telling me anything, you can see there's no data. Bot's going to go to the end and stop. If in the instance that you've told the bot all of your ingredients that you need, and the bot has recorded every quantity of that ingredient that you need in your baked good, the bot's going to say, okay, let's go down here and we'll process that baked good. Okay. Now in your process state, that's where you're going to mix your dough together. You're going to throw in your chocolate chips. You're going to make the pie filling. You're going to roll out the dough. You're going to put it in the pie shell. You're going to make the thing that you're going to throw into your preheated oven. And hopefully it's going to come out as a success. However, within the RE framework, we have exceptions. So for example, you're driving to work one morning and the day before there was no road construction, and today they've got the road blocked off from some road construction. Those are what we call exceptions. Let's say you get down here and your stove turns off. You are preheating it. All of a sudden your stove is no longer available. And you get down here and that's an exception. Let's say you get down here with, and this has happened to me before, you have everything set out on the counter. You're going to start throwing in the eggs. The dog jumps on the counter, tips over the thing of eggs, and obviously is licking them off the floor. And you have no more eggs. You can't go and borrow some eggs from your neighbor. So at this point, you may have a rule exception, a business rule exception, or some other type of exception into your process. That means you have to go back over and get those things again in order to process that transaction. Your stove turns off. It doesn't work anymore for some reason. You blew a fuse or something. If you notice, that line there is going to go all the way back up to your initialization state. So in your daily processes of living, and you're doing 1,000 RE frameworks a day, and you probably just don't realize it, you run into exceptions in your process every day. Okay, so I have road construction. I have to go do something else. I have, I can't get to work. I got to work and it's a Saturday and I don't need to be here. I thought it was Friday. Hopefully that doesn't happen to you. I got to work and I have 2 different shoes on. I got to work and there's some sort of exception in your daily process that needs to be remedied in order for you to carry out your daily process. The same thing in a business process in the RE framework. There's an exception in that rule. There's an exception in that system. You may get down here and your system idled out. You may get down here and somehow, overnight, the vendor for your SaaS application did an update and did not put that into the release notes. And so you had your selectors in that SaaS application no longer work. Those are all going to be exceptions to your process, and the RE framework provides an avenue for dealing with those exceptions, right? In an overview. So again, back in initialization, we have all the ingredients we need. We have everything that we have necessary to complete our goal of making a pie for the bake sale.
Hey, excuse me, Chris.
Yes.
Hi, this is Antoine from Home Depot. Quick question for you. If as you just mentioned, a website changed, right?
Yes.
And you don't have that selected there, or the new pop-up comes up, would you consider that a system exception or a business exception?
In my world, that's a business exception, because if you're going to try it again, it's going to do the same thing, right, Antoine? So
Right.
if you go back up to initialization, it didn't work before, it's not going to work now, right?
Right.
So what you would have to do is you'd have to put something like a try catch in, Antoine, and say, okay, try to do this. And if it doesn't work, then you have to go back and do something different. Okay. Having said that, it depends on how your organization is set up. So let's say in my organization, for example, and I'm probably getting a little too complex here, but I'm going to answer the question. We go through Azure DevOps. Okay. So when we change something, we have to put it back into test before we can put it back into prod, right? Some organizations don't do that. So you could, if your organization does not have a process like that, where it limits your ability to do that transaction, your transaction is going to stop. You can stop your transaction. You can go in there and you can look at your logs, find out where that transaction failed, do a debug and find out where that is, and then change your selectors, okay? And then debug it, make sure it flows through, and you can rerun your transaction. It just depends on how your organization is set up. Does that help?
Yes, it does. And my organization, we have to test before we can release, again.
So in that case, what I would do, if you suspect that happened, obviously it's going to fail, right? Because your selector is not going to work. You're going to get a UiPath core selector not found exception. That's going to be by default, it's going to be a system exception. It's going to go over and it's going to close everything down and try again. in those instances where you feel that that's going to happen or could happen, and I use a lot of try catches, Antoine, try and click this selector. If it doesn't work, throw me a business exception, because otherwise you're in this infinite loop and your automation is going to keep trying and trying and trying.
Understood. Thank you, Chris.
No problem. All right, get transaction data. So we have all of our ingredients here. Let's go down and get transaction data. This is actually where we're defining what our transaction is going to need from, and typically an REFramework in this format. This is a transactional format. We'll get into a linear format on the next session, how to tailor this for something that's not using a queue transaction. If you notice that this is, because it's a get transaction data, it's going to process one transaction at a time. It's going to finish that transaction. It's going to go get the next transaction. So these are going to be typically based off a queue, an Excel queue, something along that lines, which would be sitting in your orchestrator. And we'll get into dispatcher and performer a little bit later. I'll tell you my preferences on that. In your get transaction data, you can see you have a check stop signal. Now, this is the only place you'll find a check stop signal, and that just means that you can go into orchestrator and, for example, in Antoine's situation, and as it's trying to get a new transaction, you can push stop in orchestrator. It's going to stop your automation gracefully instead of allowing that long term. Now, I use check stop signals all throughout my automations. Anywhere I have a for each or a for each data, I'll put a check stop signal in there, and it's just a Boolean statement saying stop. Should it stop? If you've clicked it in orchestrator and you told orchestrator stop, it's going to send that to your automation. Your automation is it's going to give you a log message that says stop process requested, and it's going to stop the process. You can notice that it's going to stop the process, and it's going to change that transaction item to nothing. That means that to the bot, there's nothing else for him to process. So he's going to stop. If there's no check stop signal checked in orchestrator, he's going to go on to get this transaction data. And this is going to be the data that's going to be sitting on your transaction in your orchestrator queue. Each transaction has different components that you may have. You may have an invoice number. You may have an invoice date. You may have sales tax. You may have a vendor number. All of that's going to be defined on each transaction in the same exact way for every transaction in that queue. That's why we prefer the dispatcher and performer model, which I'll go into other sessions, so I'm getting ahead of myself. Because every transaction item is the same, you can use this get transaction data to get the same data from every transaction item, okay? And you'll notice in your REFramework, like I just mentioned, everything is pretty much in a try catch. We're going to try and get this. If not, we're going to do something different. Putting try catches in any type of automation is best practice because it gives your bot an alternative. If it cannot do something, you want to tell the bot to do something different, whether you want the bot to stop or whether you want the bot to try a different selector or a different variable, something along that lines. That's your get transaction data. It's very simple. Depending on the number of transaction items you may have, I mean, the data on the transaction items, you may have a transaction item with 24 pieces of data on it that you need to process. It's going to involve a little bit of coding within your workflow to set up each of the transaction items. But it's probably one of the simplest pieces that you'll work with is your get transaction data. Once you've gotten your that's horrible language, Chris. Grammar. Once you've done your transaction data, you're going to go down here, you're going to process your transaction. This is where you're going to build all kinds of different code segments. Let's say you have a code segment that is just mixing your batter. You have a code segment that allows the yeast to rise. You need to allow these yeast to rise. You need and all that kind of deal. Or maybe you have a code segment that says you place each drop of cookie dough so many inches apart on a cookie sheet, something along that line. So you can build as many code segments in here. And I will tell you, best practice is when you have a definable step, you want to build that in a separate code segment within your process transaction. That way, you don't have an end-to-end process in your process transaction. You have segmented code steps in your process transaction. So if one piece of that process fails, you only have to change that one piece instead of the entire code segment. End-to-end process, if that makes sense. And here's where you can throw your business rule exception or your system exceptions. Just using a throw activity, you could do your throws and you can have your bot go to the next transaction, or you can have your bot go and start over. And in this framework, if you don't want the bot, for example, in Antoine's scenario, and you realize that the application changed overnight, you can certainly draw this business exception over here to the end if you like, or create a new exception and draw it over here to this end process. So it ends the process gracefully. Okay. You have the ability to create different paths. And I will tell you, there's not a single developer that I've ever met. And I work with a group of developers from about 20 different companies in what we call a developer roundtable here in the area that uses this default model. We typically will have all kinds of different paths going to end, all kinds of different transitions, well, paths, transitions going from process to end or from initialization to end, because this is a high level framework for you to use that's modifiable to what your particular process is. All right, once you've processed your transaction and your transaction is successful, it's going to go get the next transaction as well. If there's no new transactions, it's going to go to the end. If you have a new exception here that you've thrown in here that says something's awry, and it's going to go to the end if that's where you drag that. Okay. End process, very simple. It's a try catch. It has no outs, only has ends. And again, you can modify this. This is a close all applications. That means it's going to close any of the applications you have open. It's going to clear your session. I don't know if you work with remote RDPs. It's going to clear your RDPs or your sessions, and it's going to stop your transactions. Okay. Let me make sure I covered everything. Logging. Let's go through some of the little steps in here real quick. If you have a system exception, let's say we have our stove didn't work, and I want to drag a new exception over here because my stove didn't work. And I could just click a new transition over here, double click on that transition, rename that transition. Let's just say my stove didn't work. Okay. And I can say my stove exception, stove error is not nothing. Okay. So if we look back up here, I created a stove try catch. My stove error right now is nothing. That means the first time the bot encounters the variable stove error to the bot, it's absolutely nothing. Stove error is there, but it's nothing to me. The bot's going to try and go down there and open its stove or turn on the stove. I have an exception, the stove error. If the stove doesn't turn on, I've just done an exception. The stove error is now an exception. So now it's not nothing. It's something. Okay. So on my transition that I've created, the stove didn't start. My stove error is no longer nothing. It is not nothing. Now in here, I can even say, okay, I wanted you to take a picture of my stove for the repairman. I want you to take a picture that you call the repairman. He says, can you take a picture of this for me? You can take a screenshot in there, and the bot's going to take a screenshot of what it sees, and it's going to go to the end of your process. And you'll have to tell the bot in the configuration file, which we'll get into in another session, where to store that screenshot. Okay, so you can create as many different exceptions as you want coming from initialization state. Now, I will tell you what I prefer. What I've grown to prefer is I've grown to take this little guy here, this initial all applications, is going to default when you open up your REFramework right there. Now, my personal preference is I want every possible exception to be noted and to be available for it to be counted and to monitored. So the first thing I do is I take this little guy out there and I put him in his own try catch. Okay. And I will have any number of try catches in here. I have a try catch if all the ingredients aren't available. I have a try catch that the recipe's not available. Maybe you can't find grandma's cherry pie recipe, or last time you made the cherry pie, you totally forgot you dropped it in the batter and you can't read it and you forgot to copy it down. Or maybe the dog ate your recipe. A recipe error, a time error. Let's say you want to bake your pie and you can remember grandma's pie it took her like 20 minutes before it was sitting out there cooling, and you realize that pie is going to take an hour and a half and you have to be somewhere in 45 minutes. Well, it's an exception. Okay. So I want all of my exceptions to have their own path so I can manipulate my exceptions to either take a screenshot or do something else, make a note, send an email, do a different log message, perhaps populate a different spreadsheet. So I make all my exceptions inside their own try-catch and go to this end process. The same thing if I wanted to come down here and I want to say, have a stove error down here, a stove exception. I could say stove exception here, or stove error. Stove error is not, nothing. And I can do the same thing here. Okay. Now in your process transaction, if you notice down here in this little guy, down here in this finally thing, you're going to see in the set transaction workflow, this is where he's setting, the bot's setting to say, well, was this transaction successful? Was it a failure? What is it? You'll see down here in the system exception, your bot's going to take a screenshot for you. That doesn't mean that has to be the only place in your automation where the bot takes a screenshot. Okay. That's all over here in this framework. You could put a take screenshot anywhere in this transaction you wanted. You can put it in a business exception. You can, if your automations run in the background and you're not seeing them run, you want to see what the bot saw when it encountered an error. So put some exception screenshots in there and have them stored. Okay. Now in my world, we store our exception screenshots in a different share drive. Each automation has its own folder set up, and we store those screenshots, often those folder setups through an absolute address in our configuration file, which we'll get into in another session. And that way, all those screenshots are stored there. Any one of us can go into those folders and look at those screenshots and see what the bot saw. If you do not set that exception screenshot, you're using something like a DevOps or something like that, chances are very likely that you will not be able to see the screenshot after it's generated unless you have it stored somewhere where you can see it. Okay, so you're going to have to identify where you want those screenshots stored. Because if you're wrapping your project up and you're promoting it to Orchestrator through a source code system, then and you don't set that exception screenshot, it's very likely you will not be able to see that screenshot. And that's a little more detail. We'll get that into that a little bit later. Excuse me. So I think what we wanted to do on this is just give a basic overview and without a lot of manipulation, and explain what this the REFramework is, why it's just very relatable, even if it looks daunting to you because you use it every day in your personal lives. Everything we do is a process, and the REFramework is just the same thing. If you think about a bot mimicking a human, you're giving the bot that same outline process that you use in your processes every day. So you're just really humanizing the bot in your same process, giving it all the possible exceptions that you yourself may encounter. You're giving those to the bot as well. Okay. Wow, that was fast.
Hey, Chris.
Yep.
This is Antoine again.
Hey.
You mentioned throw.
Yep.
I wanted to understand that a little bit more. I understand throw. It's just a matter of when do you, where can you put throws, and you put them exceptions. Where's the best place to put them, and how do you use them? I don't know if you can talk about that.
Let's say I want to. Sure. Let's say in my process state, I want to create a new flowchart. I'm going to invoke a new flowchart. I'm going to try it. I'm going to name it process 1, for example. All right. Now, just because I name it, and I'm going to get a little ahead of myself. We're going to go into this a little later. I create what I call a common folder in my folder structure. And this is just how we do it at Mary Kay. And I throw that into my common folder because that means if I'm doing another process, one that's very similar in another automation, I can simply go into this common folder for this automation, which now exists here. You know, my folder structure exists. I can copy that and put it into another automation. We do this a ton of times when we're logging into the same application, just with different automations. Okay, I have one single login code segment that I will put in a common folder, and I will copy that code, that login code segment, into every automation that logs into that automation, into that same application, using those same credentials. All right. So let's just say we created it here, and let's just say I'm doing a quick sequence, and I want to do a throw, and I'm doing some sort of for each, or let's say I'm doing an if. Let's say I've got an if statement or a try catch. Let's say try catch, because I tend to prefer try catches more than ifs. Let's say I have a try catch, and I'm going to try an activity here. And let's just say I'm going to just do a quick variable. Maybe. Oh, I'm losing my connection. Hold on, guys. I think I'm being kicked out of my VPN. Bear with me one moment, please. Unless there's a technical error, right?
Yeah, we can still see your desktop.
Can you still see my desktop?
Mm-hmm.
No, I don't want to see that. Let me get back into my server.
But you're kind of frozen. Oh, there you go.
Yeah, sorry about that. It seems that when you're on a call, when you're on the computer for longer than 12 hours at Mary Kay, they shut you down. Do I still have the presentation up, Diane?
You have the your screen up with sequence, try catch.
There it is. Okay, here we go. Sorry, guys. Let's say I want to do create a quick variable today's date or today's date. And I'm going to say, I'm going to do it as a now add months. Let's just do a -1. Come on, Chris. And I want to say, let's do an if in there. Equals June, for example. Well, we know that's going to not be correct, so I would just throw a throw in here. And here's where I would define something along, I would label it. I would call it, I love business rule exceptions. And I would just come up in here and I would just do a new business rule exception. And put a quick note on there. And I need to fix my variable to a date time. Okay. Well, I guess I need to put an 06 here. How's that? And I need a There we go. That's where I would use a throw, something there, okay? Or else I could use a throw in my catch and do another catch here. If I had a system exception, I could do a throw here. Something along that lines.
Essentially, you're telling it to go to the business exception or go to the system exception. Is that what you're telling
I'm
it to
telling
do?
it,
And then,
yeah, I'm telling it because I'm throwing it here. I'm going to throw a new business rule exception, right? Okay, so what I define here for this throw, I would put it there and I'd put a note on the end of what that was. That's going to take me to, I threw a business rule exception, regardless if this is a system exception, I threw a business rule exception. And it's going to take me to the end because I have a business rule exception here. If, let's say I just did on my main, I moved this guy over here. So now my, well, come on, Chris. So now my business exception goes to the end, okay? If you want to throw a system exception, you want the bot to retry it in here, you would throw, oh, I didn't even set that up in here. Hold on, guys. Go into my process. Let me try this guy in there. You could throw a new application exception. Instead of a business rule exception, you would have a new application exception and your whatever it is. That's going to throw a true system exception, and that's going to take you out here to this guy. And it's going to start over. Does that answer your question, Antoine?
yes, it does, Chris. Thank you.
So Chris, you had another question from
Sure.
Karen. She wants to know, is it possible for them to get a file so they can explore it? The file you're using.
Get this file to explore. You want me to clean it up first? Yes, I can give you a file, and I'll doctor it up a little bit based on our baking scenario. I'll doctor it up a little bit so you can see kind of the different things that we need to do so you can explore it. Yes, I can do that. If you'll give me a day to do that, I will be more than happy to.
Thank you very much.
And how do I get that to you?
I put my email in the chat.
Okay,
Yeah, I have that, Chris. I'll send it to you.
okay.
If anybody else wants that, do you want to send me an email? And I'll add you.
Yeah, I did this kind of quick and dirty today. Sorry, guys. I'll clean it up in the morning.
All right, Chris, one more question.
Sure.
Just your personal opinion. I do like RE frameworks. We do use it a lot at Home Depot. We're kind of fairly new within the HR space using UiPath and RPA.
You know, before we go on, Antoine, I really have to say that I had an intern last year that worked with me. He built I think he built 7 automations, and he turned me down for a new internship this year because he went to Home Depot. So you're walking a very thin line, Antoine.
We'll have drinks in Vegas. How's that? All right, sir. What do you think? What's your opinion between RE framework versus a workflow? Because I saw someone else within Home Depot who has an extensive workflow and it's a lot of decisions trees in there, and he seemed to really like that, and it looked fabulous. But I kind of got stuck to RE framework.
I build everything that we build in Mary Kay by our global development standards, because we have global development standards, because I have so many developers around the globe. And if any one of us ever decides to retire, it gets to retirement age, we want everybody else to be able to work with those automations. And then we also are able to, they're able to share. We have a global production catalog so that anybody that, when we build something for, like, say, finance or in Brazil that another group wants to use, they can just go out there and we can share that code and that automation with them. Everything we build is in an RE framework. There's not a single thing in Mary Kay we build that is not in an RE framework. you can modify the RE framework to be transactional, to be linear. And what we do in our workflows, the hazard you have on having a very in-depth workflow, a very pretty workflow, a very intricate and detailed workflow, is you sometimes will miss some possible exceptions. And if you miss an exception in that workflow, that bot's going to keep going through that workflow. Okay. In RE framework, it's going to stay in these states until you give a trigger to get out of the state. And so your exception planning in an RE framework is much more efficient, much cleaner, and much more effective than if you were to build a huge giant workflow. And even when we have automations, I have automations that have multiple workflows that are encased in these code, what I was explaining earlier, in these code segments. So I may have 6 different flow charts breaking down that one big flow chart, so that if one piece of that flow chart fails, let's say, for example, earlier, Antoine, where you have the vendor changed, you didn't upgrade on your automation night before and didn't put it in the release notes.
Right.
Then I'm only changing that one code segment. I don't have to go through there and dig through this entire huge workflow. Okay. So when you do a very large workflow like that, you're really inviting the risk of bot failure, okay, into your automation. Okay. And while you may prefer it, because RE framework hasn't been around forever. Back in 2018 at Mary Kay, RPA started on a virtual machine on my desktop. So anytime someone wanted to run an automation, I had to stop what I was doing. We've come a long way, and UiPath has come a long way since then. And when the RE framework didn't come out until, I think it was maybe 2019, maybe late 2019. I don't know and don't quote me on my dates, because then I'll have some MVPs want to beat me up. But everything we used to build used to be in these very intricate workflows, or we'd have to build our own state machine. You can see you could build a state machine here. That's all RE framework is someone went into and built a default state machine with exception paths and log messages and screenshots. You're going to find, Antoine, once you master this and start working with this more, you're going to start realizing why I would never use a workflow for this.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
No problem.
Appreciate it.
Hey,
Chris,
Chris.
will you be covering somewhere the global error handling framework or the part?
Global error, global error handling is not something I would cover in this. That's a little bit more than basic to me.
Okay.
And I don't want everybody to get really confused. So why don't we, if you can put that and you put your question in the chat with your email, then you and I can take that offline. That a deal?
Hey, Chris, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
This is DP. Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, this is a really good one. I have only one question here. Whenever we work with the loader process, I heard like, okay, loader and dispatcher kind of thing, do exist. If you are gonna make like the loader process where we don't need actually the process transaction, in fact, like we want to load the, the orchestrator through the automated process instead of like, okay, loading it by file and all that stuff, because sometimes we have to go to certain application and then, start piling up the queue so that rest of the bots can start working on that one. In that case, like how the RE framework would be helpful to us, because because our team usually like, okay, we try to do it, but sometimes we say, okay, hey, we need to stick to the protocol, to the protocol of like, okay, initialization and everything into the RE framework.
So you'll always have an initialization step. You'll always have an end state, and you'll always have a process state, regardless of how you modify your RE framework. What you would do in that instance, and we're going to get into this next session, and Diane will have to remind me of the date because I'm a guy and I forget things, is we would get rid of this get transaction step. So you're going to do your initialization state, okay? And that initialization state will then drop down here and connect to your process transaction. And you would then that changes your RE framework into what we call, or what I call, a linear framework. And that's how I teach it to everybody I teach, is we're changing it from a transactional framework to a linear framework. So we would get rid of this step here. We modify our path, our transitions a little bit down here, and we take it and we turn it into a linear. So you're still going to have all your preparatory steps. You have to have your application open. If you're using an Excel spreadsheet, or if you're getting a file from a different shared drive, you would have your directory things up here. You would get the data you need, and you would load that data using an add queue item or a bulk queue item into your queue in this process transaction. And then when it was done loading, you would go to your end process. That is a dispatcher automation. A dispatcher automation is designed to fill your queue, and a performer automation is the automation that's designed to process whatever's in that queue, whether you have that queue set up on a queue trigger, and anytime something hits it, even if it's up for a certain amount of data in there, amount of transactions, then your performer starts. There's different ways you can set up your orchestrator queues to start a performer transaction. But in that instance, if you're doing a process, you then have two automations for that one process, if that makes sense.
Yep. No, definitely, because this is a good idea. Yep. We can get rid of the get transaction, but yeah, since it is like sometimes when the things are implemented at the enterprise level, and it comes as an enforcement from like top management, hey, if we are using the RE framework, use in a RE way rather than like, okay, tweaking it. So
and there's two ways to do that. There's two ways to do that. You can either take this piece out, this get transaction data, which most developers, most seasoned developers, we prefer just to take the sucker out and get rid of it. And if you go onto YouTube and you go do some YouTube training or whatever it is, and you watch some YouTube videos of some of the developers have been doing this for a long time, everybody's can pretty much teach you to get rid of this and show you. Okay, there is another way where you can inactivate the get transaction data, and it's a little bit more. There's a little bit more nuance to it, but we'll go through both those ways in the next session on how to create this transactional process into a linear process, or what I call a linear process.
Yep. No, awesome. I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
No problem. And I will say one thing. I know there are some developers that we will, at Mary Kay, where they'll read the Excel file somewhere up in here, load it into the queue in the same state, and then get transaction data. I find that to be inviting risk of automation failure. So I use the modified RE framework for dispatcher in any of those cases. I do not load an Excel and process the Excel data all in the same RE framework.
And there is a subsequent question. I'm sorry.
You're fine.
Sending it further. If it is okay, or you want to take it?
No, go ahead.
Thank you. Sure. And what if like the dispatcher and performer is basically the same bot, which is first generating the work, and then like, because if there is no work, then generate it, else like, okay, go ahead and then whatever work is pending there. So we don't need to tweak that one. We can simply use this one. Is it?
Yeah, just keep in mind that a bot and an automation are two different things. Okay. An automation is just the structure of your code. A bot is something that acts upon that structure of the code. So yes, we have bots that are dispatchers and producers, are dispatchers and performers. Some people call it consumers and producers and consumers, either terminology you want to use. So at Mary Kay, in the finance division, at least, we have 3 bots, and they work 24/7. And so there are some instances where a bot acts as a dispatcher as well as a performer. Did that help?
Yep. Most of the cases, like where there are small use cases, definitely you need only one bot, which is working as and especially when it comes to when we do the initialization, and then you are looking for the get transaction, but there is no data unless you have generated first, and then you are going to start working on processing it. That's where like we I asked the 2 questions twofold, because we were first initially thinking dispatcher, then making another bot as a performer, or we make the same bot as a dispatcher, which means first generate your job and then you start working on it So
Sure,
kind of
and in
in
those
between.
in those instances, my friend, I would either do if you're going to set up as a scheduled automation in your orchestrator, you'd have to nuance your schedule, or I would set your queue up as a queue trigger, so that
Right.
if there's data coming into your queue, and then your bots can process that data, but they won't process it. You can even set your queues up that you don't want to process in there until there's 20 items in there. Then you can, and after 20 items, your bot will start processing. But if you have one bot in a smaller enterprise, and while that bot's processing, the bot's not loading.
Yep. No, I get it. Yep. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Hey, okay.
Can you hear me, Chris?
Is that Antoine again?
No, this is good. Can
Hello?
you hear me?
No, we can't hear you very well. Can you speak up a little bit?
I can try to. Yeah, I'm not in a conference room. Is anybody?
Yeah, Kyle, I can't hear you. I'm sorry.
Kyle, can you put your question in the chat?
How about now? Is this louder?
No, that's much
Yeah, that's
better.
great. Thank you.
Okay, I just got to lean into my mic a little bit. Sorry about that. I just had a quick question for Chris about the kill all processes XAML. I've been tasked with building something here at DriveTime, and I was, just going through the REFramework, trying to set everything up in the init state. And for kill all processes, I fed the bots, my bot, some in the config file. I specified the 3 processes I wanted to kill, and they're exactly as they are as they are named in the task manager. So I figured, okay, I'll just feed in an array of these 3 processes. The bot will loop. I can have the bot loop through that and just kill process. But I'm always getting errors with that. There's just an error has occurred when trying to kill this process, and I was like, okay, it's
Have you tried closing applications instead?
Whether or not, actually, now that I think this is a better thing, it might actually be close all apps that I'm talking about.
Okay, so a kill, and I know what you're talking about because I have some automations that open up several different applications. And some of those applications, unfortunately, are still, even though Microsoft has sunsetted IE support, some of those automation applications still run on an IE platform. They're changing, but they still run on an IE platform. So I have to kill both Chrome and IE, or Edge and IE, Edge and Chrome, depending on the application and its platform. So in those instances, I do 2 kills, and I do 1 for each kill. And I label my kills, obviously, so I know which one's working, which one's not. If you're using a remote desktop protocol, whenever you close that desktop, whenever the bot finishes, that desktop protocol is going to close. If you're using a virtual server, for example, that virtual server is typically going to open back up if your RDP session set up correctly by your infrastructure team to open up to a clean slate. Now, in my close automations, I do not use the default close. I've modified my close application and my kill application both. And I can set up some time with you and I can show you what we've done. Or we can cover that in another session coming up. I can throw that in there since we're running short of time today.
Yeah, and I think another session might be beneficial. I appreciate that.
No problem.
Yeah, and if you want that, can you please put your email in the chat? And then I saw another question about the recording. So it usually takes a day for the recording to come through. And it will be emailed to you. It's called the wrap-up session. But if you have any problems, you guys have my email, diana.gray@uipath.com. Let me know and I'll make sure you get it.
In case you didn't get that, I think that's up here, right, Diana?
Yeah.
Right.
Yes, and then the other thing is you can go back to the original event and get that as well. So there's multiple ways, but it will probably take at least a day.
Hey, Chris, this is Antoine, actually. One last thing, we do kill and close out applications in the initialization stage also, just in case some things are happen to be open. So that's our practice as well.
That is true. That's default in the That's going to be defaulted in your RE framework. Right here in your first run, you can see that you have a kill right here. That's the default. So keep in mind though, if you modify this kill, it's going to modify the kill that's in your end state. Unless
Gotcha.
you create a new kill.
Gotcha.
Anything else?
Does anybody else have any questions?
Okay. Real quick then, Diane. Here's guys, this is where we're going to talk about modifying the framework for linear or transactional. It's on September 19th. That's next Monday, right?
That's correct.
And then
And-
we have a break of 2 weeks because Diane, because we have, is it
Forward, yep.
Forward, yeah, the Forward conference in Las Vegas out there by you, Antoine. Diane expects you to be there, by the way.
Yep. Yeah, you guys, yeah, in this session, hopefully you'll notice that we really want to help you. So we really appreciate people asking questions or asking for help. That's what these sessions are all about, is to kind of work with you guys through this stuff. So we really appreciate you joining and just participating. And every time you ask a question, it's helping other people as well.
Yep. Hey, Chris, I'm actually in Atlanta at Home Depot, but we are flying out to Vegas.
Are you going to the Forward?
Yes.
I'll tell you a quick story. When I went to work for Mary Kay, it was when the UiPath conference was in Miami. Was it Miami Beach, Fort Lauderdale, Miami Beach, maybe? And so my first weekend, they turned around and said, "Hey, by the way, you're flying to Florida this coming weekend." And that's before I knew anything about what UiPath was. So you'll have a good time, Antoine.
Yeah, and if anybody is coming to Forward, please stop by the community booth. I'll be there.
Okay.
Great
Look forward to
see
meeting you. Yep.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to close tonight's session. Just again, I took notes on everybody who wanted to get material or have a private session with Chris or have him respond to something. Let me just check chat, make sure there's nothing else. I think we have it. So I'm going to stop the recording.